Hello and welcome to the Hashtag Trip Friday Night Multimedia Podcast, coming to you from beautiful Super Centex studio on Franklin Avenue in Waco, Texas.
Beautiful. Beautiful. It is beautiful.
I'm Chad Conine, along with Trip Sports editor Brice Cherry. Brice, I think one of the things that we do well on this podcast is try to recognize greatness wherever we see it and wherever we find it. Mm-hmm. And with the passing of Eddie Van Halen yesterday, I have to kind of point things in this direction, because Eddie Van Halen to me was a virtuoso. You know, like, he wasn't like the coolest rocker like a Led Zeppelin type, and he wasn't the most important rocker like a Nirvana, you know, like Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, but he was a virtuoso at guitar. I have a specific Van Halen story that I want to tell you in a minute. Okay. But just so that we're not completely off the sports trail here, can you give me somebody that you think of in the sports world that is kind of a virtuoso in the same way, that kind of defined their craft and was just better at their craft than most people?
So when I think of the word virtuoso, I think of almost someone who's sort of a magician, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, he can sort of blow your mind, he or she. Mm-hmm. And as you are aware, Chad, I am a big basketball fan. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times these questions take me to a very basketball place. Right. And your immediate thought might be, well, if you're talking about a magician, he's probably going to say Magic Johnson, because, magic is in the name. But I'm going further back than that.
I know what you're going to say.
Pistol Pete.
Yeah. I saw that on your icons list on Facebook a couple of weeks ago.
Well, yeah, you know, he's the... yeah, that's a great point. I did one of those top 10 deals on Facebook where you list one of your favorite athletes each day. And of course, every one of mine were like a Houston Oiler, Houston Astro, Houston Rocket. And then Pistol Pete was the outlier. Mm-hmm. And I always, even though Pistol Pete sort of came along too soon for me to really appreciate, I always got into watching highlights of him and reading about him and stuff. There was a little movie about him that was pretty decent, but a lot of good books have been written about Pistol Pete. Mm-hmm. But I just, you know, loved the way he played, because he did things on the court that were clearly for show. Mm-hmm. You know, he understood that, you know, you try to win, but you also, if you can, try to put on a show for the fans. I mean, he treated like regular games like it was an all-star game, you know, and I appreciated that fanciness of his game, and I would go out in the driveway and try to mimic his moves a little bit, and it was fun, you know. So that's the guy that comes to mind when you say that.
Now, you know, I can think of a parallel between the two guys, because both of them were ahead of their time. Both of them would have been amazing YouTubers.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
You know, I mean, they.
So there's
I remember one of the first things I watched on YouTube way back in early 2000s was Pistol Pete highlights.
There's this guy on YouTube. You remember when N1 was a big thing, the mixtape tour or whatever? Right. There's this guy called the Professor. Yeah. Who's kind of a Pistol Pete type on the playground, you know? Right. He's got a lot of crazy handles and moves, and he'll go out on the playground and he'll put on like a Spider-Man suit and just beat somebody, you know, wearing a Spider-Man suit or whatever, you know. Yeah. I love that stuff. That would have been Pistol Pete, you're right.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a friend of mine texted me late last night that he was thinking of me and watching Eddie Van Halen videos on YouTube. So there's that, you know, there's that sort of parallel. And I'll get to my Van Halen story now, because I was a big Van Halen fan, and of course my friends, I have multiple friends that have texted me, you know, about Eddie Van Halen's passing, and I appreciate that, because I mean, it's true. I was, you know, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? And so Right Now was a big song, you know, like during like my middle school, high school type of age. But here's the thing. I played high school freshman golf, and I didn't have a very good year. I got, you know, a bad case of the duck hooks and just didn't have a very good year. I mean, I wanted to play high school golf really bad, but it just wasn't going all that well. So it comes up, summer between my freshman and sophomore year, and I had some good friends that had just graduated, and we had all got Van Halen tickets, right?
Okay.
For August 5th, 1993. It was an important day in the history of me.
Okay.
And then it turns out we come to that summer and qualifying for my sophomore year for the golf team. Guess what day that fell on?
I'm going to say August 5th.
August 5th.
1993.
Right? So I had a big decision to make. Golf or Van Halen.
Mm-hmm.
And I chose Van Halen.
Yeah. Well, you did have a case of the duck hook, so that was
right.
probably, a good decision. And it's not like you've given up golf. You still play.
No, I still enjoy it. In fact, I enjoy playing golf. I enjoy playing the guitar. There's the things that I'm not great at. Maybe not as good as I'd really like to be, but I enjoy the heck out of them. So I picked, but I also started being the sports editor of the Panther Post that sophomore year too.
Okay.
So it kind of went that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But
those
also,
who can't do right.
Yeah. Wait,
Yeah.
Say that again.
Those who can't do.
Oh right, yeah. I've never heard that.
Right.
I've never heard it. Okay, but whatever. But do you know what happened on August 4th, 1993? By the way, the day before that I went to see Van Halen, because we enjoyed the heck out of this as we were waiting in line, because it was at Coca-Cola Starplex in Dallas, and so we had lawn seats, and so we got in line at like 3 p.m. so we could be right at the front of the lawn seats, and have that experience of it. But do you know what? And we talked about this thing. It was one of the most amazing things that's ever happened in the history of Texas sports. Happened on August 4th, 1993.
Is this when Nolan Ryan showed how Texan he is?
It is that exact thing. Have I told you this story before?
No, but go on.
Yeah, so the night before it just happened that Nolan Ryan threw a little bit too close to Robin Ventura, and then Robin Ventura made the historically bad decision of charging the mound against Nolan. I mean,
that didn't work out well.
There are moments in your life when you make a decision that's going to define who you are for the rest of your life. And Robin Ventura could go on to win multiple World Series as a manager. He's still going to be the guy who got beat up by Nolan Ryan.
Yeah, no doubt. That's unfortunate for him. It's kind of unfortunate for Kermit Washington. Who was the guy who threw the punch that almost killed Rudy T.
Yeah.
Because he'd done some okay things in his career to that point, but he became known as the guy who threw the punch.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately for Rudy T, for a long time, he was the guy who received the punch.
Yeah.
And I think once he did win a couple championships as a coach, that sort of redefined him a little bit. But
was he hospitalized?
Oh yes, he was hospitalized, and he had like a brain bleed. I mean, it was bad.
Yeah.
So anyway, are we going to talk high school football?
I was about to say, let's pivot.
Okay.
And go to high school football for the last couple
Ross
of minutes
and
of this
Friends?
podcast. Huh?
Like Ross and Friends?
Pivot, yeah.
Pivot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Good reference, I
Yes.
guess. Yeah. So we'll make this pivot by going to your pound for pound high school football rankings. What do you got this week?
Well, first of all, I do appreciate that we do mix in some other things into our podcast. We want to give a little something for everyone.
Right.
But no changes in my rankings this week. I still have the same top 5. Everybody won last week, so
give us a rundown.
I will.
Yeah.
So number 1 is Mart. Number 2 is La-Vega. Number 3 is Jonesboro. 4 and 5 are the C teams, China Spring and Crawford.
Mm-hmm.
Not C in terms of their grade, but in terms of their first letter. And we've talked a lot about these 5 teams on the podcast. I do want to take this moment and again, maybe for the second time this season on the podcast, rail a little bit on the txhsfb.com rankings.
Mm-hmm.
And
did Jonesboro drop again?
yes, they dropped again. And so I'm digging into it a little bit more. So Jonesboro starts the season, preseason number 2 in the state in these rankings. And now they are number 9, and yet they are 6-0, okay? Mm-hmm. They've done nothing to disprove that preseason ranking. They've been either at the state quarterfinals or the state semifinals each of the last several years. So they've lived up to these rankings in the postseason in the past. 5 teams ahead of them in the rankings have losses, and one of the teams, Borden County, is 3-2. Now, Borden County lost to the number 1 and the number 2 teams, so that one, but 3 of those 6 wins by Jonesboro are 45 Mercy Rule wins. None of the games have been close. Maybe they haven't played the same caliber of opponent as some of those other teams in the rankings, and I guess that's the thinking in it. But I've never been a fan of winning and moving teams down. I mean...
Well, Brice, you know more about the six-man football landscape than I do.
Okay.
Are there areas of Texas and maybe groups of teams that are kind of like the SEC of six-man football in Texas? And might it be that Jonesboro is a little bit on the outside of that?
Traditionally, the power in six-man football has certainly been more to the west, and Jonesboro probably is on the fringe of that, being a Central Texas team. But I think over the last maybe 20 years, we've seen a little bit of a shift in six-man, coming a little more towards, the central part of the state. Obviously, we've seen teams around here that have done really well,
Blum and Abbott have won state championships.
Blum and Abbott. Before that, Calvert was another one that won a state championship.
And they're pretty solid this year, it looks like.
Yeah, they're right up there. And so, there are some really strong six-man programs around here that shouldn't be overlooked. And to me, Jonesboro is one of them.
You know what we need to do? We need to try to get Granger Huntress on here with this.
That'd be good.
One of these
yeah,
days.
we could do kind of a six-man podcast.
Yeah. It'd be good.
It would be smaller. Anyway.
So yesterday, to pivot again, I was in China Spring watching the Cougars practice, and I got to talking to Jesse Lopez, their baseball coach, and he's a football assistant.
Right.
Jesse's one of those guys that I know from Midway.
Yeah. You have a number of those guys.
Right, there are a lot of them. So we got on the subject of the Mart Panthers, who are the number 1 team in your rankings, and China Spring is number 4 in your rankings. And it was kind of one of those things, and let me stop down and go off script for a second. But we were having a frank conversation about the fact that when we get into the playoffs, unfortunately, it's not too hard to look into the future right now and see that there are going to be playoff games that teams are going to have to forfeit. Doesn't that seem like an inevitability?
It certainly seems like a possibility, and a strong possibility. Yeah, which is unfortunate about the COVID era, and I don't know what the UIL's plan. Probably worth checking into on what they'll do if that happens.
To a certain extent, if you're in a situation like Fairfield is, where you have somebody test positive on a Friday, you don't have very many options.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid it's going to be one of those things where you just shrug and you go, man, it's tough, but that's the way it is. Yeah. But and certainly not putting a jinx on anybody, but in 2AD2, if you have that situation in 2AD2 and Mart can't go forward for that type of a reason, it's almost like you don't have a legitimate 2AD2 champion.
Yeah, that would be, I hate to use this word, but tragic. That's just because, first of all, it's a quite elite group, teams that have won 4 straight state championships. And Mart has the chance to join that very exclusive club, and Rodrell Freeman, I think, could do something that I don't think any Central Texas player has ever done. That would be something in itself. So yeah, Mart is the team to beat, and if they were not able to defend their crown because of COVID, you're right. It's sort of, you hate to use the phrase asterisk, but it does sort of put an asterisk on.
Well, and I don't bring it up for any other reason, and hate to even think about it. But to me, it's just a situation where whoever won 2AD2, if they didn't have to beat Mart or Mart didn't lose, then
Right.
Yeah. But it brought up another interesting point between me and Coach Lopez. And then I said, look, I'm not trying to diss anybody or cause a fight, but I think Mart versus China Spring would be a dang good game. So would agree or disagree?
First of all, I'm going, just as you sort of concede to me that I know a lot of, maybe more about six-man football, I'm going to concede that you have seen both these teams in person this year, whereas I have not. As you know, I'm in the office on Friday nights. But first of all, this to me would be a nothing to gain game for China Spring.
Let's take it out of that realm.
Well, okay, but I just want to offer some context here.
Okay.
Years ago, Mart had a long running series with Grosbeck.
Mm-hmm.
And Grosbeck was always at least a class higher in terms of classification. And it got to the point where, as Mart is wont to do, they were beating Grosbeck pretty repeatedly, year in, year out. And Grosbeck finally said, enough of this. I mean, we're canceling this series. And it was kind of a story. It was like, dude, this series has been going on 80, 90 years, you know, and now it's just, gone. Right. It had been a really, I think fun rivalry for those two towns. But Grosbeck was like, nah, we get nothing out of this because, we're just going out every year and having to explain why we can't beat Mart, which is a class at least below them.
Right.
I think that, again, while conceding that these teams better than I do, I would think that China Spring's depth would be a big factor. I mean, that Mart would have a hard time competing with. I mean, Mart has very little issue going up one class and beating teams. I think when you start going up two classes, that's when the depth factor really starts coming into play. And these rankings, as we know, or that I have, are pound for pound. Mart in its division versus China Spring in its division, but it's not. If you put China Spring up against Mart, I think China Spring wins that game. That's my take on it. But would it be fun to watch? Heck yeah!
And I think that was my point. It's a game that I would love to watch. I agree with you that China Spring would prevail at the end of a close game. But here's the thing: can Mart jump out on 14 points on them in the first half? I mean, and mitigate that depth factor.
They've got the players. I think the thing that would be fun for Mart is they would be highly motivated.
Yeah, well, but see, here's what makes Mart so dominant in where they are right now. When they put 11 guys on the field, I mean, they send 11 guys out there on the field, right? Against another team's 11 guys. Don't think about how many guys are on the bench and can't come in, right? But the 11 guys they put out on the field can match up with a whole lot of teams in the state until you get into teams like Westlake the other night or a Duncanville that puts 11 guys out on the field that look like they're just about ready to be the 11 guys on a college football game.
And I'll tell another quick Mart story from this year, so it is relevant. I told one on the podcast earlier this year about how Kevin Hoffman, a coach, came in and said, this so-and-so from our area has this open date in their schedule, and it was a team within Mart's classification. He was like, they're not playing us, He knew better.
Right.
He also told me a story, Kevin did, about getting a call from maybe an assistant coach, like a voicemail, from an assistant coach at Cal Allen. And he was like, do they realize we're 2A? He was just completely confused and baffled by this. But it almost makes you wonder if Cal Allen had seen Mart and gone, man, they could give us a game. Yes, to your point, Mart, you're 11 versus their 11. They're going to make some plays against just about anybody.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's why I said that, and then Coach Lopez was trying to tell Coach Bell that I'd said that as I was starting to do that interview.
I was surprised that you had said this because it is one of those things that, I mean, I say it could be bulletin board material. They're not going to play each other, so I guess. You know.
It's not like I'm out there saying, yeah, Mart could even whip China Springs' butt.
Right.
You know, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying
you'd like to see it.
It would be
You'd
a
like
fun
to see that
game.
game. Yes.
Yeah, so I think we're about out of time. But any other cross classification matchups that would intrigue you?
Absolutely. The one that comes to mind that I'd love to see, La-Vega and Midway.
Yeah.
Again, you're talking about 2 classifications up that La-Vega would be playing.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly La-Vega, you know, doesn't really duck anyone. I think they would be up for that challenge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but again, you feel like Midway's depth would be a big factor. But, you know, La-Vega's got some ballers. I mean, and have had for the last several years. So I think there's a lot of guys that, you know, would make a lot of plays in a game against Midway. So that would be one I'd be intrigued to watch. Really, any year. I think, you know, if you're going back to maybe the Tanner Mordecai Midway team, you know, that probably wouldn't work out as well for La-Vega because that Midway team is pretty stacked. But you know, this year versus La-Vega, you know, maybe that's a little more even. I don't know.
Yeah, that's intriguing. You know, it's interesting because before Midway had as many Power 5 signees as they had in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, or at least D1 signees that they've had in the last 5 to 10 years. The team that I would have compared Midway to throughout the state, just size-wise and all sports-wise, would have been Cal Allen. And, of course, La-Vega beat Cal Allen in non-district this year. So
there you go.
Yeah. Anyway, it's all fun things to think about. That's what we do here on the podcast, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We like to dream.
All right. Well, that's another week in the books.